the information of the site evaluation into consideration and proposes a septic system for our staff to review. So currently that formal process is not in place. New subdivisions are required to do groundwater monitoring borings. They are required to do percolation testing. But oftentimes, historically, those were done not on every lot, maybe every other lot, if they could get a consensus that the subdivision had uniform soil conditions. So there's going to be some lots that don't have any information, and they're going to be required to do these things prior to us issuing a septic permit for those.
Well, let's start with just all this testing.
Sure.
What do you anticipate that all the testing, the boring, and all the things that weren't done before to cost?
I really can't say. I don't know that I want to turn it over to my septic professionals that are here to put them on the spot. But we haven't done that level of analysis, and I'll tell you why. The Tier 1 standards require these things. The LAMP requires these things. The LAMP provides for, hey, instead of doing perk testing, let's do soil profiling. Let's do looking at the soil and not have to do a formalized test and bring water onto the site. We've tried to come up with alternative ways of obtaining the same information. So ultimately, the financial impacts of these rate requirements were analyzed as part of the environmental review for the state's on-site wastewater policy. And so we haven't taken or had to go through the financial impacts because they're forthcoming. They are, it's just a matter of how we do it now. If we just don't look at our local geology or we kind of see this as a customized implementation plan of the Tier 1 standards.
Okay, let me do it this way.
Sure.
You're going to have to do all these things for a new installation. When an existing system fails, you're going to have to go back and start from the beginning. Is that essentially correct? You're going to have to, rebore and percolate and do all these same studies.
We intend to require a boring for every new lot, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that historically Monterey County has not been requiring groundwater monitoring borings. Systems were simply installed. And so we are unaware if there's groundwater residing 3-4 feet below the leach field, even if it's just a few months out of the year. We don't have that information. So we are going to be requiring that boring be done so that we can confirm that groundwater is going to be protected.
So for an existing system that has to be replaced, you have to start off at ground zero and run through the entire process.
The differences are that we're asking for a boring or a test pit to verify separation of groundwater, but we're not necessarily going to be requiring a formal percolation test. We would be able to take the soil analysis and compare that to table, I believe, 5.5, which said based on a soil type, you can get an application rate, which is how much wastewater can go per square foot of dispersal field trench. So there are,
That's in lieu of doing a perk test, that's the way I understand it,
Yes.
is that correct?
correct.
And that's true for new development and repairs and upgrades?
For new development, I believe percolation testing is required. For repairs or replacements, that's where we're going to be allowing the site or the soil evaluation in lieu of percolation testing. Sure.
Some of my clients are low-income people, and they are not going to have the financial resources to do all of this work. Let's say a complete replacement. So one, how do they pay for it? And number two, is the county going to make money available to these low-income people so they can, like they do with student loans, here's the money paid back over 20 years or whatever. Is the county going to step in with money to help anybody do these repairs?
The state's on-site wastewater policy does include a provision that says that state revolving funds shall be made available to local jurisdictions to help try and finance the repairs or requirements.
To individuals?
It doesn't specify.
Okay.
From my understanding, though, in conversations with state water board staff, is that they would be looking to come up with a regional solution as opposed to a site-specific.
Okay, so if they can't make the repairs, does the house get shut down?
if they're not able to make the repairs, does the house get shut down?
Yes,
They would be asked to pump the system as needed in order to prevent, failure conditions from posing impacts to
so
groundwater
pump the
surface
system but
water.
not repair it,
Until the repair could be made.
but they don't have the money.
Our LAMP doesn't get into those level of specifics, and in my 11 years here, that hasn't been an issue that I've had to face.
Well, but 11 years, you haven't had to deal with this either. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
In this revamping of regulations, are you considering alternate systems?
Yes, we will be.
I approached the county maybe 5 or 6 months ago. This is are you Nikki?
I am, and actually I mentioned that system just a little while ago, must have been right before you walked in.
Yeah.
Just in the fact that we have had a freeze for the past 2 or so years on approving new technologies. But once we get our LAMP in place, we've had to put all of our resources into this. Once we get our LAMP in place, we have every intention of opening up the doors to all the proven wastewater technologies to provide competition, to try and keep costs as low as possible.
You spoke to their California legal representative 4 or 5 months ago, I think.
Okay,
And this is called Presby Wastewater Treatment Systems. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with this, but they come up with a system, they use it all over the world, they use it all over the United States, they've used it in San Diego, Placer counties. Basically, you're digging about a 3-foot deep pit, laying these pipes in and covering them with sand. And it's very effective and it would kind of mitigate groundwater issues, which seems to be the biggest obstacle.
yeah, so the criteria to get a new proprietary alternative on-site wastewater system approved is laid out in section 5.13 of the LAMP. So we identify the information that we would want. The system requires a NSF certification, specifications about the particular product, the design standards, and the treatment objectives that they're able to meet. There needs to be an installation manual, an operation and maintenance manual, a sample of the service contract. One of the things I didn't mention earlier when we talked about supplemental treatment systems is that oftentimes they require ongoing monitoring and maintenance, hence the need for electrical and telemetry. When that's the case, we require a service contract to be in place with a qualified professional. Typically, it's on a 2-year term, and that's something that the county would monitor by way of an annual operating permit. And so the owner of the supplemental treatment system would be required to submit the biannual monitoring reports indicating that they're maintaining that system in good working order, as well as maintaining the contract with their O&M provider. And that has to do really with the fact that these systems are only put into place when there's no other option, because if we did a standard conventional gravity flow, it's going to impact groundwater, it's going to impact surface water. And so if it's not being properly operated or maintained, those impacts are going to incur. So we need to ensure that it's being kept up.
This system is completely passive. There's no electrical need. Their engineers that I've spoken to, with the size of my system, he recommended 3 50-foot runs. He said I'd never use more than a quarter of it.
Yeah.
So it's, this might not be time, but I'm wondering what information I could get back to them to provide to you.
So at this point, I've been telling the alternative treatment proprietors who have contacted Monterey County that we're not accepting new systems at this time due to resource constraints, but I'm taking their contact information and I have a list of individuals that I'm going to notify when we're taking applications and going to be accepting those materials.
Do you have any idea of a timeline of that?
I anticipate that we will open it up as soon as we have our LAMP in place and have kind of ironed out the implementation of it.
Of this.
We want to make sure that this is going before we start taking on more and basically overload ourselves more than we can
Perhaps
handle.
by next summer?
We're hoping to get this in place in May, then we'll still have to work to amend our ordinance. So there is some time, but we are interested in doing, in getting these new technologies approved. Yes,
So if you want to replace a septic tank, that means that you have to wire it for electricity now? Or is that only new systems that have to be wired with electricity?
those are the supplemental treatment systems. If
Okay.
you can meet,
If required, it's not.
thank you, if it's okay, I'll respond.
Yeah.
If you can meet the minimum standards for a conventional septic tank, gravity septic tank and drain field, no telemetry, no monitoring, you just kind of get to go on that passive route with your annual every 3 to 5 year maintenance. And the county there's no operating permit, there's no ongoing maintenance contract. So that's the goal. We want to see as many conventional septic tank systems go in as possible. It's gonna be, a lot for us to try and manage those monitoring reports, and so, we wanna make sure groundwater and surface water are protected, but if we can do so with a conventional system, by all means, we wanna see that going.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Could I please ask you to outline what a conventional system is going to be in the future? I know what it has been in the past, but it feels to me like it's changing.
Sure. A repair or a replacement, okay, so stepping back a ways, let's get into how a septic system works. Primarily, you basically get the solids to fall out of your effluent, so you have a liquid wastewater, and that goes into the soil. And the soil, especially the aerobic or shallow soils that have oxygen transfer with the ground surface, that's where the primary wastewater treatment occurs, because the bugs in the soil really they rely on, or it's the oxygen. The bacteria that rely on oxygen, the aerobic bacteria, they do the best form of wastewater treatment. Anaerobic bacteria do break down wastewater, but not nearly as effectively or efficiently as aerobic bacteria do. So with that, the goal of the state's on-site wastewater policy is to keep on-site dispersal as shallow as possible, in the top 5 feet if possible, or even shallower. So new systems are going to be limited to 4 square foot per linear foot. That is the vast change from what we've done historically in Monterey County. And so oftentimes we would see trenches that were 5 to 10 foot deep, and we would give credit for the sidewalls. And so a 5 foot deep trench got you 10 square foot per linear foot, and the deeper trench, 10 foot, got you 20 square foot per linear foot. But now the tier 1 and the LAMP requirements specify only 4 square foot per linear foot. The EPA has issued regulations or recommendations that indicate that relying on the sidewall isn't effective because when you're doing that, when you're expecting that the sidewall, 10 feet of sidewall is going to be where you're getting your transfer of leach field to the soil, that means you're operating in saturated conditions or anaerobic conditions, so you're not getting the effective treatment of the wastewater. And so really that's the goal here. The purpose is to get the soil doing its job and treating the wastewater. So that said, the LAMP, as written, is proposing that that repairs or replacements, and those are systems that are not proposing to increase wastewater generation, would be allowed to be credited up to 10 square foot per linear foot, or effectively a 5 foot effective depth trench. And so that will only be allowed when you can't make it shallower or have less infiltrative area per square foot. So you would need to max out and make it as shallow as possible, and if you can't, we would have the authority to confirm that the qualified professional has exhausted all the potential areas on the site and that the only thing that's going to work is a slightly deeper trench. Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know if I'm correct, please correct me, but it sounds to me like a vast majority of what might have been considered a conventional system is no longer going to be allowed. I mean, because, typically we do trenches that are 10, 12 feet deep, maybe 50, 60 feet long, and so it sounds to me like those aren't going to be allowed in the future. I wonder if, in terms of groundwater, whether or not, if you can show that groundwater, say year-round, is 150 feet from the bottom of an effective trench, seems to me like it should be exempt from that quote aerobic requirement, because otherwise you're really limiting the area on a site that you can, just have a disposal field. So I guess I'm just encouraging you to consider the geology and the groundwater, and to allow a few more conventional systems if they meet a situation where you're not polluting groundwater. And, I mean, that seems to me like an important factor, and I don't know whether you've taken it into account.
No, I take your point. I think it's a great point, and I actually I made that argument to the water board. I said, hey, if we could show a 50-foot separation of groundwater, what the heck, you know? It sounds like that would be protective of it, and it certainly would be protective of nutrients and pathogens, but it does nothing for nutrients, especially for nitrate. Nitrate is essentially only taken out of the ground, well, it's taken out some in the aerobic process in the septic tank. It can be further reduced in a supplemental treatment system that has recirculation or processes made specific to denitrify. But otherwise, you're only going to get nitrogen reduction in the soil if it's disposed of in the top, say, 2 to 4 feet. Essentially the root zone where plants, shallow rooted plants, can take up those nutrients and utilize them. Otherwise, those nutrients are going down, down, down. Over time, our code estimates about 40 grams of nitrogen are discharged onto the ground per single family dwelling per day, or into the ground. And over time, 40 grams a day, 40 grams a day, 40 grams a day, that groundwater that had a 50-foot of separation is going to make its way down to the groundwater where we are pulling water, our drinking water from. And so that kind of stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, oh, well, that's hard for me to argue. I do think it'll make its way there eventually. And so with that, we're looking at shallower systems and kind of a wholesale change from what we've done historically in Monterey County. Did that help provide some context?
Thank
Yeah, I have a question, man. Since this is all about contamination of the groundwater, 80% of all the water in California is used by ag, and only 20% by us. So is there an equivalent plan set up to address the polluting of the groundwater by the ag industry? They're using 80% of all the water.
That's a good question, and while I don't follow ag discharge waivers real closely, I do believe there are programs in place by the regional water board, because that's their primary charge, is protecting
Yeah, Monterey County is
groundwater.
probably 90% of all the water is used by ag.
My understanding is that the ag community is highly regulated for their discharge.
I mean, I think this is overkill, is what, I think a lot of this is overkill on this scientific analysis of the polluting of the groundwater. That's what I think.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify something. Is there an avenue in the current LAMP that if someone cannot meet the shallow requirements, that it's been exhausted and the professionals agree to that, that there is an avenue for some kind of variance or something, or are they just out of luck?
So a repair and replacement, you can't get a shallow system in. The way that we're going to be proposing it is we would be allowed as a county without a variance to allow up to a 5-foot effective depth. So that would potentially shrink the amount of dispersal field area you would need. That has to be, we need buy-in from the water board before that'll be accepted. And so I've done my best to try and outline why we think that that's appropriate here in Monterey County, but ultimately that's at the discretion of the water board to approve. Because it states in the on-site wastewater policy, leach fields shall not be credited with more than 4 square foot per linear foot and shall not be more than 3 foot wide. And so it's very prescriptive and doesn't allow for a lot of wiggle room. So we are trying to take that into consideration. Also, worst case scenario, maybe not worst, but next case scenario would be a supplemental treatment system could be incorporated in to pre-treat the water, take out those nutrients, clean up any pathogens, and then potentially you can discharge closer to a surface waterway or a groundwater table. Another point to make is that historically, Monterey County has had an across-the-board application rate, which is the amount of wastewater you can put on the ground per linear foot of trench, of 0.3 gallons per square foot of trench per day. with the lamp, we are proposing to take the site-specific soil evaluation that we're gonna be imposing upon you to work and say, if you have really fast perking soils, you don't need all that area. So you might end up needing a half or even a third of the infiltrative area that you would have formerly needed. So while you're gonna have to be much shallower, you might need a lot less, and therefore your length might not change too much. You just might save some money on rock. So it might benefit some properties. That's very optimistic, I understand. But,
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question, man.
Like, just-
Go
just-
ahead.
Can I answer? So to follow up on her question, if we have a shopping center, asphalt parking lot, system fails, what's gonna happen there? Because you talked in here about permeable versus non-permeable, and are you gonna apply this new 4 foot per square foot ratio to this repair in an asphalt situation? I mean, a shopping center has no, it's not like a home on 5 acres that has plenty of extra land. It has no extra
Sure.
land. It's all hardscape or building or whatever, and it seems to me that ordinance is written really toward the residential aspect, but you're sort of missing that commercial part, and there's a lot of places that have small restaurants that just have a parking lot, and how are they gonna deal with it? Or in our case, we've got 30 tenants, and each one has different, you know, we have 5 different systems in there, and it's a pretty complicated thing, and I don't, you know, I don't see anything in the regulations that really kind of sets us aside and says, okay, if you've got a commercial facility with a parking lot, you're gonna deal with it this way as opposed to being treated as a residence, which assumes you're gonna have a lot of land around it and you have the ability to do these things, and it's easy to
yeah.
put tanks in and out, relatively speaking, easy to dig trenches versus uprooting an entire parking lot and then saying, well, you can't put it back there now because it's a non-permeable surface, it's asphalt. So,
Well, I think that the standard for an impermeable surface, it does apply across the board for the reasons that I mentioned before, that soil, the most beneficial wastewater treatment occurs in the shallow soil based on that oxygen exchange. So whether you're residential, whether you're commercial, if you're covered by an impermeable surface, that wastewater isn't getting treated to as effectively as it could. Again, and then also with that, you're not gonna have any sort of root uptake because there's cover, there's no roots, therefore your nutrient loading is gonna be higher than if you did have in an uncovered situation. And so I think that that is pretty, the available area for repair isn't specifically addressed, but I think that the fact that if the situation calls for a repair and it's gonna need to be covered by an impermeable surface, then the LAMP calls for supplemental treatment with nitrogen reduction to basically pre-treat it. You gotta clean it up before you can put it in the ground.
supplemental system.
Yeah.
So if anything fails in the next X amount of years, or mandated, any commercial facility is pretty much gonna have to put a supplemental system in.
I mean, the specifics, I don't wanna just say yes across the board, but if that,
Generally speaking.
if the only option